I'm Kurt Hauswirth with Public Radio 90 WNMU-FM, and this is the Local Spin. In fact, the first edition of it. And my guest today, I'm glad to say, is Alex Watanen, also known as Gerko. He's a rapper, poet, and punk rock musician from Michigan who's been making noise throughout the Midwest for over a decade. So welcome to the Local Spin. Glad to have you.
Thanks for having me. This is awesome. I didn't know it was the first one until you just said that, but that's really excellent.
Yep, this is the inaugural Local Spin, so I'm glad to have you on today. So you've titled your latest release 30-Year-Old Freshman, and it's an EP, which you wrote during your first year of college, and you said that that decision was made after you were kind of working at kitchen jobs and doing rapping on the side at punk shows, so a little bit of a difference in style there. Tell us about that period of time, kind of before that freshman year, the release of your EP. Did you feel like there was a place in the Upper Great Lakes region for what you were doing?
Well, I mean, I guess I'll answer that question in two ways. First of all, I never really felt like there was a place for what I was doing in the region. I felt like I had to carve my own little area out. I think there is now, but I don't think there was when I kind of entered this genre. I used to play, like you mentioned, I used to play in punk rock bands. So that's like where I cut my teeth, so to speak. And somewhere along the line, just bands in that arena are so short-lived and it's so tumultuous. And it was like, we would write songs and then we would record and then we would play and then we would break up. And I got sick of that. And I've always loved hip hop, but I was kind of like a closet hip hop head. So I waded out into it just as a thing to do for fun. But the longer it went, the more I put all of my effort into this. But I was doing a style of hip hop that is, I mean, plenty of people explore these styles in bigger locales, but in the area, yeah, I was kind of a oddity of sorts. But I would play with whoever. I would play with other rappers sometimes, but that was always kind of sometimes you'd feel like some standoffish vibes. Mm-hmm. But punk shows is just where I felt at home. I just felt at home. And quite honestly, what I learned as time went on is if what you're doing is cool and interesting and good, people will give you an honest ear, especially if they're at a space where they're used to varied bills with different genres. And I mean, I've had people really appreciate my music who I did not expect to. I played a show up in Hancock once at the Orpheum Theater like 5 or 6 years ago, and quite a few older people really, really appreciated it. And I walked into the venue seeing the age of the people and kind of assuming like, oh God, I'm going to scare people away. But then in terms of like the EP and the years leading up to it, I'd become disillusioned with my love of hip hop and with my love of performing. And I felt like I'd burned all the gas in the tank. At this point, looking back on it, I think I was burned out and working dead end jobs. But at the time, that it just like what it was the music wasn't enough for me. And I started to recede from it in around 2016. I want to say I was still writing, but I wasn't really performing. I was kind of taking a break, and a whole bunch of my friends died. And so 2016 was this really galvanizing year where I guess I just took stock of who I think I am. And like at my core, I think I'm an artist. So I like reemerged on the other side, probably mid 2017, somewhere in there. I started to kind of solidify my resolve, and my idea was like, I'm going to go to college. And when I realized that, it's like, it just started to sync up, and I just started working on music again.
Nice. That's an awesome story. I mean, that's kind of what I think a lot of artists go through, is this period of like maybe a valley where it's like all of a sudden you just feel like passion is escaping, or maybe other things are pulling the creative side away. And sometimes it's either life that seems to do that, or, having that moment where you're like, you know what, I just need a break and focus on something else and kind of, love it a little bit more because it's not as present in our lives. So that's really good to hear that you got through that and you're kind of back on the creative side of things. Sorry to hear about kind of what happened in 2016, but
it's life, man. I mean, I'm sorry too. I miss them, but a lot of them, it's just, life is a mess. Things happen. And yeah, on some level, absence does make the heart grow fonder. Some idioms don't really hold their water, but I think that one does. So yeah. With the artistic process, it was like the longer I went without it, the more I realized I loved it.
Awesome. Well, that kind of goes into my next question about comparing performing when you started and kind of where you are now. There's definitely a lot of transition even just in the last year, but of course, what you just spoke about too from the last few years. So I know it's much different now for performances. I mean, we're not out being able to do live performances, but I guess in general about the creative process, do you feel differently creating back then as compared to where your head is now for thinking of new projects?
Yeah. Um, I mean, part of it has got to be that I've been in classes now for a couple of years, and I've been actually studying writing academically. So some of that's leaking over. You know what I mean? My understanding of the craft of poetry has deepened. I have a broader vocabulary, so I'm more intentful about like the craft side of it, like word choice, which is something I, as a rapper, that's like the whole thing. But I've got more tools to explain what I'm trying to do, and I understand more conventions. When you understand conventions, you can break them intentfully. I think in the past I would break in conventions, and sometimes it worked, and then sometimes it came off as sloppy. And then like I've done a lot of hip hop projects, and the strangest thing is the one that sticks out to me as my favorite is the first one, outside of the stuff that I've done recently. I did this EP, I think like 9 or 10 years ago I was in a group called Eager Maniacs, and it was I was a front man from local punk bands, and then there was this other front man from local punk bands called named Calvin Stark, and so he went by Stark, and we did a duo thing, and we didn't want to call ourselves like whatever, you know, like both of our names, so we came up with Eager Maniacs, and we released an EP called Bad Weird, and it's like probably an LP actually in terms of length, but it felt like an EP. And I still listen to that, and it's like my cadence is different. My writing style isn't as mature or as, you know, I don't have it as dialed in, but I still, for some reason, that's just the one project I go back to. And then there was like in between now and then, there's just this whole cavern of songs that I like them, but there's always something I feel like I could have done better or would have done differently. Okay. So that's what I run into in the creative side. In terms of performing, though, the one thing I've always felt really confident about is getting on a stage and doing what I do in whatever it is, you know, being in a punk band or I always feel more at home on stage than I do in the studio. And I know a lot of musicians who feel the exact opposite.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't know if you remember, and I think I'm right about this. I'm fairly certain that my first time on stage, you were on the stage. Did you?
Was this Furnace?
Yes, Furnace. Oh, yeah. I did guest vocals, and it was a way to break me of my stage fright. Ron, who had played, he was like, you know, one of the main driving forces behind that group. He had hit me up and just been like, dude, because we were playing in a punk band together, and I was afraid to play live. He's like, just come up on stage and do like background growls and some song. So yeah, there's some picture from that era, from that show, and I was pretty sure that was that, because I knew that you filled in on bass, but I know that Kyle Heikla filled in on bass, and so did a couple other people. So I wasn't sure, because it was a very you know,
it was
what I
like
mean?
A fill in the blank for basses for a little bit because Ron had injured his hand, and
Yep.
he needed some people to
fill
in.
The cast. Yeah.
Oh man, yeah, that's a blast from the past for sure.
Yeah, man.
I remember that picture. I remember looking like the most nerdy person on stage, playing the bass and like wearing my northern sweatshirt and whatever else. It felt like a, you know, duck out of water kind of thing, but at the same time, it was so cool because, you know, it was accepting, and it was one of those places where you had all kinds of people coming together to just celebrate live music and celebrate creativity, maybe a little in an aggro kind of way, but still a lot of fun.
Yeah, I miss that place. I'm glad that I had that. Like coming out of high school, if I hadn't had that, I don't know where I would have landed if it hadn't been for the music community.
Yeah. And that's, again, speaking to how important live music is, even in a small area like this. I mean, we need venues for, you know, the alternative groups, for the mainstream kind of groups, whatever it is. I mean, there's a lot of creativity up here, and I'm really hoping that once COVID is over, or at least on its way out, that we can safely get back to that. But
me too.
Again, here we are doing, you know, a Zoom interview and those kind of things. So we're kind of making the best of it. Just a reminder, we're speaking with Alex Watanen, who goes by Gerko, and he's got a new EP that he just released on Bandcamp called 30-Year-Old Freshman, and we're talking about that right now. And you talked about this EP that it kind of deals with mental health problems that almost kind of pulled you away from rapping in general. Have you found that this creative process helps you in that regard with mental health? Or does it feel like it's a double-edged sword where some days it's really helpful and some days you're like, I just need to get away from this? We talked about that feeling of needing to step back and then getting back into it.
It's interesting because I was literally talking to my psychologist about this last week at our last meeting. It's definitely a double-edged sword. On some level, it's like, I wonder, it's like, okay, do I write about the dark things because I've been through a lot, or do I go through a lot because I choose to look at things through this dark lens? So that's something that I have to try to keep an eye on. I don't ever want my art to be an excuse for me to wallow in misery. And I do have friends, or I've even engaged in projects where, looking back on it, I use this phrase, I call it grief porn. It's like, okay, it's grief, but you know, so I feel like as long as I'm taking that, whatever bad thing I'm talking about, if I'm talking about a bad thing in art, which this project is basically just that, but I'm trying to go somewhere with it. I don't want it to just be an examination of like a hard time. I want it to have some sort of silver lining, or have a direction it's going in that is positive. And although this particular project doesn't necessarily have like a happy ending, I have kind of an arc that I'm planning based on my last 2 EPs, my next EP, and then hopefully an LP after that. So there's hopefully like a hero's journey, kind of an arc to it.
Nice.
But then on top of that, what I've basically dialed in, and I guess that was like really what me and my psychologist arrived at, was that I have to be careful not to use it as an excuse to view things through a negative lens. But as long as it's a positive way for me to process my emotions and I'm getting good content out of it, then I should continue to explore those avenues.
Yeah, that sounds really healthy. I mean, talking about music and art as, portraying a negative thing, but giving it an opportunity to maybe leak out some of that negativity, or like escape from that negativity, while also giving somebody else maybe a touchstone to say, yeah, I've been through something like that, but we've all, that becomes a commonality, and then we can all kind of grow from that in some way, or learn from it, or escape from it somehow, at least for a little while.
Yeah.
That sounds like some of
Yeah.
the great things about music in general.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess because I came up on punk rock, and even the hip hop I listened to is a little bit left field. Not all of it, but a lot of it. There's something about like, if you feel like you have a problem, or you feel like, something's disturbing, and then you realize that other people are dealing with these problems, I think it makes the problems feel smaller. It makes them feel like, okay, they can manage it. Maybe I can. And I know that there are times where younger kids, teenagers or whatever, who listen to my music will tell, whenever somebody tells me that something I wrote helped them get through something, that's it for me. That's like the most important thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely one of the biggest things out of music, is finding that relatability. And if you can take it and latch onto it for a while, or carry it with you and it helps you in some way, that's awesome. So going to the EP and talking about the 4 tracks on it, you've got 199666. I want to make sure I get the numbers.
You did.
And then we've got Lump, Nail Clubbing, and then the title track of 30-Year-Old Freshman. So you talked about having lots of tracks, lots of songs over these last few years. Of course, you have more material. Did you have these 4 in mind as kind of a project, or were you like, these 4 songs along the way, I'm going to take these and develop them, or like take them with me and put them in this EP? How did that come together?
Okay, so with this one specifically, what really came, sometimes like in terms of songwriting process, I might use something that I wrote 2 years ago as like a seed for a new idea. So some of that might have happened with this, but I don't think it did. It felt pretty organic, like it came out like in a chunk, so to speak. But what happened is I talked to Atma, the guy who produced the beats. He's a really excellent, he's an excellent instrumentalist from the Upper Peninsula, and he's a buddy of mine, and we've never worked together, but we've talked about it. And I'd finally just gotten a handful of beats from him that I purchased, 5 or 6, and 5 of them ended up becoming the EP. And I had this whole solid idea. And then there's this one song, Help, that like, I like the song, but I just don't like how it came out. I was just like, nah. And I recorded it and everything. Like the engineer is a good friend of mine too, Will Jessup, and he kind of argued with me about it. He's like, you should keep it on the, and I was like, no. And I'll tell you this, I am very, very, very happy with my decision to not include it. I think it just feels like a more cohesive package as it is. But I do think that that's something that maybe people who don't make music don't think it's much about, like sequencing your songs on a project or trying to arrange it. I mean, sometimes it does just come up like, I got some songs, I'm going to put them together. But with this one specifically, I thought a lot about how I wanted it to kind of flow from front to back. And I feel like it's better for it. I feel like it's a much more cohesive piece.
Mhm. That's cool to hear that side of the creative process too, because like you say, it's not just about putting together a song and then say, okay, here's one, and then we can just throw 10 of these together and it'll just all be on a collection. I mean, talking about that kind of album or, EP journey along the way, that's another side of the creative process that is, it's cool to hear about. And it's pretty important, especially if it's coming from a really personal side of yourself and reflective point, things like that. And with that too, like the content of this EP, has some pretty heavy stuff, and we've talked about that already so far, how it talks about feeling like the artistic process is just hogwash or whatever. There's a lot of misery and despair, but at the same time we've talked about how we can kind of grow out of it, or we can kind of like triumph over this. So capturing all those feelings into this EP, does that feel like it's catharsis for you in some way? Does it feel like you've maybe released a little bit of that?
Yeah, definitely. And especially like this project was recorded in the same session as my previous project, which is a 2-song single called Heavy Empty.
Mhm.
They have a similar feel, but they're kind of decidedly different. Heavy Empty was basically an homage to those friends who died. One of them is a song that's specifically about one friendship. And then the song Heavy Empty is kind of just me ruminating on like the year of 2016. And then this, as much as it's still dark, it felt like, as you get closer to day, it gets brighter. You know what I mean? And it's still dark, but it's less dark. That's what this felt like to me. And it felt incredibly cathartic, especially because I, like you said, I wrote it during my first year of college, which is a few years back now. But it was at a point in my life when I felt like hopeful for the first time in a while. I had been stuck in kitchens. I had felt like I was spinning my tires in the slush and like I was getting nowhere. And as much as this is me examining a piece of my life that maybe felt bad, I was examining it from a vantage point where I was pretty sure things were getting better. And by the time I released it, things were quite obviously better for me. So, I mean, yeah, it was incredibly cathartic. And I guess at the end of the day, that's probably the reason why I just find myself coming back to music no matter what. I think people are kind of drawn to things, and I think that I just don't feel like myself unless I'm doing music.
Yeah, that's absolutely relatable too, where it's, if you've got any inkling of creativity, there's something missing if you haven't had that opportunity to sit down and at least do something, even if it's for one song or one track or one beat, whatever it might be, just having that moment where you're like, I created something and somebody else can take something from it. I mean, that's a great feeling right there. Even if the
Absolutely.
material is on the heavier side, or if it's dealing with some heavy stuff. I mean, that's really good to hear that that's helped you in some way, and it can potentially help many other people too. So very cool. And you did mention Atma, so just wanted to quickly talk about that. He's another musician from the Upper Peninsula. How did you get involved with the Atma? You said you've been friends with him for some time, and you've
Yeah.
purchased some beats from him.
So he is an elusive person. He's a very, very hermity kind of person. And that's one thing I've noticed. I mean, this is a stereotypical kind of an assessment, but in my dealings with DJs / producers and then rappers, I feel like the rapper types are usually much more personable and approachable, and the producer types are usually a little more not introspective. I'm blanking on the word, but you know what I'm saying? Like they're not as outgoing. Yeah. They're not as willing to put themselves out there. So I'd known him online for years before we had even met in person. I ended up meeting him at one of my shows years after I knew him through the internet. But I met him through the producer who actually made the beats for Heavy Empty, Formula 42, he's a tattooist out of I can't remember which town, but it's over by Baraga. It might even be Baraga. Tyler. And I met Atma through him. He was basically just like, there's this guy I know. His beats kind of sound like Blockhead, and Blockhead is one of my favorite producers. He made beats for Aesop Rock for a really long time.
Oh, cool.
So I was like, there's a kid in Upper Michigan who makes beats that sound like Blockhead. So I was like, I gotta, and he was right, I think. I mean, this particular project doesn't necessarily sound like, you know what I mean, stereotypical Atma style. I think that I specifically chose some darker or more kind of hype contemporary sounding beats, but he makes a lot of really interesting beat tapes that you can find on the internet. If you look up Atma, that's AATMA, and Bandcamp, he should be one of the first, if not the only name that pops up. And he's got a lot of really excellent music to check out for free over there.
Nice. Oh, well, that's awesome that you're able to have like kind of a personal connection with, the instrumental side of things, where almost, is out of that friendship, and then you're like, well, let's make this a little more professional all of a sudden. That's kind of cool. And also kind of keeping it local that way too, keeping it in the Upper Peninsula. I mean, I'm sure there's like sample packs and loops that you can buy from all over the place, or from some, big name person on the West Coast or something. But that way, this is also kind of a local project that way too, which is really cool.
Yeah, I really prefer to work with local instrumentalists whenever possible. I've done stuff with people outside of the area, but generally speaking, it's usually like features or like friends of mine I had really close friends from Wisconsin. They broke up, but like for a long time, we were a unit that did stuff together. And it's a lot easier to talk about something, even if you end up doing it over the internet, with somebody who's plugged into the same mindset as you. Mm-hmm. And I feel like, you know what I mean? Youpers are youpers. I think it's just less gets lost in translation, and it feels more like a homegrown project, more like something that came organically out of my region instead of a mishmash of different regional styles.
Yeah. And that could always be a future project too, where you maybe want to look to, I don't know, get some more exotic sounds, or just something that might seem a little more left field to what you've been doing too. And like you said too, you've got a few other things planned, right? You've got another EP and then an LP as well.
Yeah. So the next thing I have planned, I have the title, but I'm not going to say it right now because I don't want to pull up my own spot. But it is with Atma. My next EP is going to be another 4-song EP with Atma. I would say 50% written right now.
Awesome. And would you say that your future projects are going to be like the sun rising more? Like you'd mentioned how 30-Year-Old Freshman feels like you can kind of feel like the sun is approaching, but not quite there yet.
The next EP, I think I'm still examining some darker subjects, but I'm doing it in a much more tongue-in-cheek kind of more fun way. Like I think I'm making fun of myself for being a little bit how do I want to put it? Like almost like hyperbolic about my misery, right? Like it's almost like, as much as I don't feel like I'm wallowing in my misery, I'm kind of poking fun at that with a couple of the songs. But yeah, two of the songs I don't even have them finished yet, but they're about different brighter topics, and the instrumentals are not nearly as minor scale sad sounding.
Sure, maybe some stuff in Dorian or whatever. Well, that's good to hear. You've got some future projects as well, and we're looking forward to that too. We're speaking with Alex Watanen. He goes by Gerko, and he's got a new EP out called 30-Year-Old Freshman. We've been talking about these 4 tracks and the backstory behind them. And do you have anything that you want to add either about the EP or about any other future endeavors?
Everybody should listen to Blanco Suave. They're like the best hip hop group to ever come out of Marquette, and I have a massive amount of respect for them. They're my buddies. So that's just a plug right there. And then beyond that, I don't know. 30-Year-Old Freshman is my favorite project I've done so far, and I don't intend to stop. But thus far, it's the thing I'm the most proud of. And if you want to give it a listen, it's available on all streaming platforms, and I exist on most social media platforms if you're trying to check me out.
All right. Well, fantastic. And great to talk to you about all this. And thanks for doing this edition of The Local Spin.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kurt.